Yeah. So let's kick off. As mentioned, very excited to get this going. I think a few weeks ago, I put out on Lenny's Slack which folks would people most want to hear from. Shreyas was the joint most upvoted person. So very excited to have Shreyas come on. Shreyas and I actually do work together in a capacity as well. I know most of you know that I work with Lenny, but Shreyas and I also do work together and have for the past few months. It's always quite fun to have him in this setting. I've never been able to host him in this way, so I'm personally excited as well. I know that I see a few familiar faces from the student alum of Shreyas's course as well. I think Tanmay, Amin, it's great to see you here too. So yeah, I think we can kick off because we're at 4 minutes past. So just a bit of a housekeeping really before we start this in earnest. Please keep yourself on mute. This is like an AMA with Shreyas. For folks who do want to ask Shreyas a question, we're using the Slido, which I'll share on the chat right now. If you have asked Shreyas a question on the Slido and your question gets called out, and you obviously put your name on it, I'll first ask to see if you are on the Zoom and able to ask him a question. If for whatever reason you're not there, I'll ask this on your behalf. So please keep yourself on mute, turn on video if you can, and I see so many of you already have. I'll be kicking this off with a couple of questions before turning this over to all the questions on Slido, which is asked by all of you on this call. This will be recorded, so in case any of you have to drop off or can't make the full hour, we will send this recording to you after this event. If someone is taking notes, feel free to just DM me with it directly. I'm happy to share out your notes along with the recording to everyone. I'm sure folks here will find that helpful. We've got close to 200 people, over 600 registered, so I'm sure folks will find your notes valuable. Having said all that, let me introduce our very special guest, Shreyas Doshi. Shreyas is a top startup advisor and executive coach. He's previously led and grew several products at some of the most iconic companies at Stripe, at Twitter, at Google, and at Yahoo. He lives in the Bay Area, and we actually met. We actually got connected through Lenny. So yeah, with that, let's start off with the first question. Shreyas, very curious, and I'm sure a lot of folks here are too, on what helped you like decide when to ultimately leave your job at Stripe and go the whole solopreneur route. Did you have a strategy in mind for this next chapter of your career when you left Stripe?
Yeah, thanks, Shrey. Really great to see you all. I see many familiar faces and also faces, folks perhaps where we haven't met or haven't been on the same Zoom together. Very thankful that you all decided to join today. Very much looking forward to our conversation, and I'm really hoping it is a conversation. Obviously, I'll be answering some questions that you all posted on Slido, but hopefully we'll have some live interaction as well. And Shrey mentioned I'll try to be as candid as possible. And in cases where something is not for the notes, I will let you know. But otherwise, feel free to share things and share them with folks so that they can follow along and learn as well. Okay, so with the question that you asked, Shrey, so I left, just so folks have a little bit of like more detailed history, I left my role at Stripe after 5.5 years, almost 2 years ago. So this was May of 2021. And for the first time in my career, I actually decided that I would take a break because like most of the time, I'm sure this is the case with many of the folks on the call as well, between two roles, I barely took a week off. And that was the best case scenario. So I had been doing this stuff for about almost 20 years. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to take a break now. But of course, I'm not the kind of person who kind of I'm not yet at a place where I'm just having fun playing golf all day or all week. So I don't know why, I'm just wired that way. I find that I just have to do something productive. And so what I decided to do as I was thinking about this next move, obviously I was considering the traditional path of, okay, I've done this product leadership thing at Stripe. Where do I go from here? Maybe I go to an even earlier stage startup. I even talked to a few companies and entertained a few job offers for CPO type roles. But ultimately, that process of actually talking to a few of those companies was very insightful for me in deciding what to do. because I realized that actually this is not what I want to do. I wanted to take a break. So that was one part of it. My son had just turned 13. And so I was like, I want to spend some more time with him before he doesn't want to spend any time with me. So that was part of the equation as well. I was going to do a home remodel. So that was going to take up some of my time, etc. But what I mainly realized as I was trying to make this decision is that I was doing some advising on the side. And it really started during COVID because everything was over Zoom. So it was easy to like just get on calls with founders who were looking for advice on product or strategy or go to market. And what I found is that two things happened as I was doing it like on the side, very informally, all pro bono. Two things happened. One is I found myself really enjoying the advising conversations. So that was one. Second, as I was speaking with founders about whatever problem they had towards the end of the call, I'd ask them, so was this useful? And many founders told me some version of the following. They said, like, I got your name from our VCs or our board or somebody else, somebody I knew, that, oh, you should talk to the Shreyas guy, but yours was among 4 or 5 names they gave me. And I talked to all the 5 people, and 4 of them said the same thing, right? For whatever problem it is. You said something entirely different and yours resonated. So I'm actually going to try it out. Right. So I heard some version of this feedback very often. So that made me realize that, look, hey, if I'm enjoying this kind of advising work so much that at the end of an intense 1.5 hour call, I'm actually leaving with more energy, not less energy. And I'm very much looking forward to the next conversation. So if that's the feeling it's evoking in me, plus if it's uniquely useful for founders, then maybe I should try it out. I did not have a specific strategy in mind. I do now have a strategy for where I want to take this chapter of my career. But frankly, it took me almost 2 years of doing various different things to actually devise the strategy. The actual move was primarily based on the factors I shared with you. So it was a combination of multiple factors, including, frankly, the observation that Stripe had done reasonably well, and some of the previous companies I'd been at had done reasonably well. So that it also gave me the luxury, if you will, of being able to try a non-traditional path. So it was a combination of those factors, but the main thing was this high degree of resonance with what started out as just like a thing I was doing on the side.
I love that. I also love the fact that you didn't have this super detailed plan when you left like a pretty great company in Stripe to go this route. For those of you that joined a little later, I mentioned to some of the folks who joined earlier that I also work with Shreyas in a capacity as his course manager and chief of staff. Shreyas, you launched your career course a few months ago. Could you quickly just explain what is it, why you started it, and the early impact of it on students? Because it seems a little different to the advising work that you just touched upon.
Yeah, for sure. I started teaching on Maven about 6 months ago. And teaching was always on the cards. Like even as far back as 10, 12 years ago, I thought, oh, someday I might do some part-time teaching. Again, mainly because I was a TA in grad school when I moved here to the US, and I loved the TA stuff. I realized like actually there's something like fun about it for me. So I knew I wanted to do it. But at the time I thought, oh, I'll maybe apply for a lecturer role at Berkeley is close to where I live, or UC Davis, or maybe Stanford is a little bit of a drive, but it might be okay. So that was the idea. But then obviously I realized that there is a lot more impact and scale and reach one can have if one is kind of going through the new means of teaching, which is online, and going direct to students, because you can have a high degree of control. So that's kind of sometime last year, I decided I had the space to start actually thinking about, okay, let me launch my first course. So as Shrey mentioned, the first course ended up being, I teach now a PM career management course, and later on today, perhaps we can talk more about the course and whatnot. But the reason I started with that course is a few things. One is over the years, I was often the person that somebody in my network would call with a career crisis or a career emergency. I don't know how that happened, but that's just how it ended up being, that I would get sometimes these kind of panic texts like, Shreyas, can we talk? And I'm like, okay, what's going on? And they'd say, oh, like I have been job hunting. I have these 3 offers and I need to decide on them by the end of this week. And I don't know what to do. Okay, so now mind you, these were pings from what many of them were from people I would consider to be among the best product people in the world, like exceptional at product work, right? And proven success, impact, all of that, right? So I would get on a call with, say, a friend or a former colleague, and they would ask me, like, okay, so I have these 3 offers. So what should I do? Which one should I pick? Or which one would you pick? And so I would have to ask them to pause and say, hey, first of all, like, the question of which one would you pick is the wrong question, because I'm not the one making the decision. You're the one making the decision. But secondly, we can't decide which of these 3 awesome offers is the right one for you to pick. First, we need to understand what it is that you're trying to do. And then like, they had no idea. What do you mean? What am I trying to do? So then I came up with, and this is over a long period of time, 10, 15 years, I came up with the certain questions that I would ask. That I don't want to hear about the specific offers. First, I want to ask you this question and this question. And again, I'm happy to share some questions that I asked. But the point is, at the end of that conversation, they said, wow, okay, it was a half an hour conversation, but it gave me a lot more clarity on what I need to do and how I need to approach these offers. And while initially these 3 offers seemed equivalent, I now understand that actually one of them is the ideal fit for what I'm trying to do. Right. So what I wanted to, then again, this happened over and over again. Right. So what I realized is that while these are world-class folks, like they're exceptional at the PM craft and PM leadership and other things, oftentimes as PMs, we find it difficult to manage our own careers. And if you think about it, your own career is your most important product, right? Because it's the basis for all the other products you'll create.
Yeah.
So that for me was one of the bases. And it was not just about job searches and job decisions. I also found that there were people who were, a second example is people who are just like following the one path, which is, okay, there is a ladder, this is the level I'm at, and this is the next level I want to be at. Again, great at the product craft. But in many cases, I observed over the years, whether they were on my team or they were peers, that they ended up being very unhappy. And what I realized is people don't have ways of, especially people who are like advanced in their career, don't have ways to figure a lot of these things out. What kind of path should I take? Should I go for the next level? Should I go to a startup? Should I take on more scope? Another aspect I saw was that people did not know how to work with their manager, how to manage up, how to create the right perception within the company, how to plan for their promotion. And then that caused a lot of frustration as well. And even managers don't quite understand that stuff really well. So in this course, like I decided to put together everything that I had learned. And a lot of it is driven by even mistakes I made that I don't want others to make, mistakes I made in my career. For instance, I was, for the longest time, not very great at self-promotion and planning out for my promotion. And so this course covers the end-to-end of one's career. And what I wanted to do was to give senior PMs and PM leaders, as well as kind of other design eng leaders, a way of thinking about their career and every step and decision in their career a lot more systematically in a way that's authentic. And it's kind of includes things that basically are not shared everywhere, like anywhere. So I thought I'd just put this together in a weekend course. So it happens over 2 days. It's very intense. But yeah, that's how I decided to do this course. And it's been fun.
I think that's incredible. I know that I mentioned this earlier, but I'm seeing more students as well just join John, Amin, Joao. I see folks that are also part of Lenny's community who have taken your course. Last question before we move on to audience AMA, actually, and just quickly on the course. If people wanted to learn more, where should they go?
Yeah, so if folks want to learn more, let me perhaps share my screen. So if folks want to learn more, you can go to Maven. Turns out this course ended up being the most popular course on Maven. This is the course page. So you can go in here and basically just go through all the content over here. Like we've tried to make this a very, very detailed page. So you'll find a lot of information, including student reviews and whatnot. And like Shrey, you mentioned, there's many folks already on Lenny's community who've taken the course. And lastly, again, there's lots of reviews and whatnot. Lastly, one thing I wanted to share is that there is actually, for folks on Lenny's community, I thought as part of being here with you all, and thank you for your time, you can get $100 off using this code, which is Lenny 100. So all you have to do is just go to this checkout page, the enrollment page, and put in this code. And then when you hit apply, you'll see $100 off right away. And so this is exclusively for Lenny's community, as a thank you to you all for joining. And hopefully I will see some of you in the course. But yeah, just going back to where you can get more information, just go to Maven and click the first trending course here, and then you will get all the information you need about it.
Fantastic. If anyone missed any of those details, I'm happy to send a follow-up, or you can just DM me on the Slack. I have pasted the specific code that Shreyas shared too, in case. Now is the most fun bit. Let's switch over to audience AMA. I've shared the Slido link. So for anyone who wants to ask questions and upvote questions for Shreyas, the Slido link is on the Zoom chat. We already have quite a few, which is fantastic to see. Let's start off with the first question on this kind of pretty trending topic of AI. This was asked by Vidit, and he asked, he's driving right now. He DM'd me separately, which is very sweet on his part. In this age of AI, how can product managers keep up with this technology, incorporate it into work, and best position themselves for the future?
Yeah, so I have a number of thoughts on this topic. And the first thing I wanted to share on this topic of AI, and it's the most important thing, is something I had tweeted to my super followers, actually. So perhaps I can kind of just share that for a second. And here we go. I'll just let you read this tweet that I'd shared with my subscribers on Twitter, because I think it is first really important to recognize this. Right? So there's a lot going on with AI, and we see AI everywhere. And I see a lot of this kind of sometimes reluctance and almost fear of trying to engage with what's going on with AI. And I just wanted to call out that oftentimes this reluctance is rooted in our fear of missing out on a big wave, or fear of having to learn something new, or just fear that we'll become obsolete. Right? So sometimes it's easier for us to just ignore what's going on and create a rational reason around it, which is, oh, it's hype and I just want to do my job. I don't want to bother with all this AI stuff right now. Or like even saying things like, oh, look at this stupid chat GPT output. People keep hyping AI, but it's so dumb, right? Like people talk about this. And again, many of us find like rational reasons to support this viewpoint. But what I want to share, at least my perspective on AI on is, which is, and again, this is something like I shared many months ago before ChatGPT and other things launched, is that I firmly believe that AI is this next big wave in technology. And I just want to call out that in our lifetimes, we'll only see a few big waves in our careers, right? A career is 30 years, 40 years, whatever it ends up being. You'll probably see 3-4 waves, big waves, right? And I do strongly believe that AI is it, right? And before this was mobile, and mobile wasn't that big, but in the 2008, 2009 period is when we saw mobile. And before that was the World Wide Web, right? And again, we've had some smaller ones, right? Like cloud or whatever, but the really big waves, right? And before the World Wide Web, it was PCs, right? In the 80s. And so again, like we don't see many of these in our lifetime. And in some ways, we are lucky to be in the middle of this right now. Okay, so now I think if you just recognize this truth, and if you are feeling reluctance and fear, if you can just like, instead of ignoring that fear and creating some sort of a rational sheen on it, like just accept the fear, because that's the only way you'll take the next step, right? So if you're then ready to take the next step, right, what is to be done? So first, I'll split it into a few categories. So category one is, I would highly recommend that you use AI products. And you can use them for your work, for your product manager job, right? And the kinds of things you can do, and again, there are people who've talked about this or who are talking about this, But the kinds of things that I have found super useful are to get ideas from, say, ChatGPT for, how to say something, right? Recognize that you can get ideas for how to say something for all sorts of things. The obvious stuff is, oh, write me a stub PRD for this, or write me a blog post for that, right? That sort of stuff is like obvious, and I know many people are doing it. But I'll perhaps share some non-obvious things you can use ChatGPT for. First one is when you are having a difficult conversation. Okay, now as product people, we often have difficult conversations with people. And what I find is that like most of the anxiety and most of the problems that occur from difficult conversations is basically a messaging problem, right? So all of these problems are messaging problems. So if we can message much better, right, we can be a lot more effective and influential, right? You can actually use something like ChatGPT today to tweak your message, right? Say you want to have a conversation with somebody about them not being as engaged on certain tasks and missing deadlines or whatever the case might be. You can literally go to ChatGPT, describe the situation, and then it will provide a response to you. And most people stop at that response and say, okay, I'll tweak it. But what many people don't realize is that you can further ask ChatGPT to refine the response for you. Okay, so like when ChatGPT gives you some output, you can say, is there a different word for this thing that you used? Or could you reframe this to make this a little softer? Or give me 4 or 5 different options for how I might say it, right? And it will do all of that for you. And again, I'll just share a quick example because none of this is theory. I actually did this, and again, I shared it with my super followers. I did this for a tweet. So, the details are not important, but what I'm showing you here is I had this kind of tweet that I wanted to write, and it was a little difficult because I wasn't sure how to express a certain competitor. And so basically, I went through this whole process of, hey, ChatGPT, what is a good way to say that a company is past its peak, right? Then it gave me something, and then I said, but how about this? Is there any better way to frame that? And then I said, okay, now this is my current version. How is this? And then I asked it for 3 or 4 variants, right? And on. Again, the point is not like, I'm just showing this as an example for a tweet. But the point is you can do this for anything, right? Any kind of communication. So I would highly recommend that you do that. Now, I'm not just recommending that you do these things for just the sake of your job, although that is already a very good reason to do it. The second category I want you to pay attention to is, as you use these products, you will get ideas for how to incorporate and how to make your current product better. And there are probably a couple of variants here. One variant is that you work on a product that basically is likely to get completely disrupted with AI, right? And there are plenty of examples of such products. Many kind of SaaS products fall in that category. For instance, like if you're doing any contact center SaaS thing, right? A lot of your users are actually going to disappear overnight, right? Contact centers in call centers are not going to be the same as they are 3, 4, 5 years from now, maybe even 2 years from now, right? Instead of 200 people in a call center, there might just be 5 people. And that impacts all sorts of things, including your per seat pricing and it basically impacts everything. So there are entire categories that are going to get disrupted, right? So that's one reason why you need to understand what the potential of these tools is. And the only way you'll understand the potential of these tools is by using it. The second is where maybe your product is not going to get disrupted, but you ought to be thinking about what sort of features will create differentiation in your product where you're using generative AI or other kind of new approaches, right? So that's the second category I wanted to call out. Third category is, and I know this is something PMs are often like wondering about, will my job get obsolete? Here's my belief about that question, and I'll pause there after that. My belief is that what is going to happen is that teams are going to get significantly smaller. So that's number one, right? A result of teams getting significantly smaller for the same amount of work is that there is less coordination overhead. An impact of less coordination overhead is that now the project management aspect of project management is and always has been a key part of product management, right? But the pure project management aspect of product management is going to be less important. It's still going to be a key part of it, but it's just going to be less important than it is right now, right? Simply because the teams are smaller. So that's number one. Number two, you are going to be in a situation where you are now going to be expected. A lot of these kind of what I call proof of worth tasks, running SQL and creating summaries and writing notes, and all of those are very important aspects of the PM role, but they are not the main PM. They've never been the main part of the PM role, right? The main part of the PM role is going to become even more important, while these other commodity things are basically going to be much easier to do, right? Like you like basically you will not be spending 3 hours writing some complex 5-table join SQL and marveling at the beauty of the SQL you wrote and sharing it with your colleagues so they can appreciate the SQL you wrote, right? That is just not going to be as vital for your job. What is going to be vital is your judgment, your instinct, and creativity. Because in a world where everybody has access to these AI tools, where your market research, instead of taking 2 days, takes you 2 hours, right? Because you outsource the market research to these AI agents. What is going to happen is the differentiation is going to be created by what you do with all of this, right? And that still boils down to creativity, and it boils down to insight, and it boils down to empathy for the customer. So as you're thinking about how you should think about your skills and how to adapt to this future, I would say it is very, very vital that you understand how to grow your empathy, how to grow your ability to have better judgment, so clear thinking, and how to improve your creativity. Because those parts of the job, I firmly believe, are the ones that will help you create better products than your competitor who has access to the very same AI tools. Okay. So my main recommendation here would be, as you think of the long term, please invest in upskilling in those areas, because that's going to ensure that you have very high job security and that you're still able to make a massive impact in the products you work on.
I'm already getting yams and Zoom chat about what a comprehensive answer that was. Shifting gears, more of a reflective question was like the next upvoted one, Shreyas. And the question is, who are the happiest PMs you've met? And what do they have in common?
Yeah, I love that question, because I have always been a huge proponent of finding happiness, even though the PM job is very difficult. And like I personally have always been extremely driven and for all sorts of things. But I've found that getting to VP, CPO, etc., but not being happy is basically useless. As I think, I love the question because it made me really think about people that I've worked with that were actually happy in the PM job. And what I realized is that, like, perhaps I can share a few characteristics. What I realized is some of those characteristics were not very obvious. The first one is that I generally saw a pattern of them being extremely competent at the job. Okay. And part of that being like them understanding their strengths and taking roles that play to their strengths. But the other part being them having a strong urge to improve themselves and get better, right? So that's one aspect. The other aspect, which I alluded to, is that they were in the right role for themselves, right? Too often people end up in the wrong role, and whether it's the wrong domain or the wrong type of company or the wrong product stage or the wrong level of seniority, right? And it's not that the happy PMs or the very happy PMs don't end up in those situations, but the point is when these PMs end up in those situations, they actually try their best to change the situation, right? And in some cases, exit the situation. In other cases, change the circumstances, right? So that's another aspect. Third aspect that's related to what I just said is that these folks have very high agency, right? They don't just default to blaming the circumstances, right? And then the next aspect is you can only really have high agency if you're optimistic, right? I've met many cranky pessimistic PMs, but I've not yet met a happy pessimistic PM, right? So there is some amount of optimism that I think is key. Another big one is that they have some friends at work, right? And it doesn't have to be 20 friends at work. It's probably one, two, or three friends like that they truly consider as friends at work, right? So that's super useful. And then the last characteristic I'll share in my observation is that the happy PMs, they are not maximizers, they are satisficers. And you can look up what that is, but basically, they're not trying to get the highest output and the highest kind of maximum results from everything they do. Because when you try to do that, you end up naturally disappointed, right? So I think happy PMs, in my view, have shown this ability to satisfy in some conditions that like, okay, this is not optimal, but it's okay, right? And they have the judgment to figure out where they do need optimal results or optimal outcomes, but they're not looking for optimal and maximum outcomes in everything they do. So those would be a few characteristics that like I've seen common across the happy PMs I've worked with.
Thank you for sharing. I thought that was a great question. The person asked it anonymously, but if you're on this call, I think that was such a great question. The next one is actually asked by Satish. Satish, are you able to come off mute and ask Shreyas the question live yourself? No worries if you can't. I'm happy to ask it on your behalf, but it might be good for folks to get a change from my voice.
Hey Shreyas, I'm Satish. I just had this question, like, what's the worst possible way to be a PM? Just tell me where I'm going to die and I'm not going to go there. What are things that a PM shouldn't do? If you could touch up on that.
I love the idea behind it. As many folks have said, more famously, Charlie Munger has said, invert, always invert, right? Like inversion. Try to figure out what not to do. And I think there is a very important lesson there because look, most people are trying to figure out what to do, right? But the observation is if you're fairly smart, then you will likely be more successful if you can better understand what not to do because you already have the ability and the skills to know what are the 2 or 3 possible right things to do, right? What you want to avoid is you want to avoid going down the wrong path as much as possible. Because despite what like conventional wisdom suggests, right? Like around, oh, just try 50 things and see blah, blah, blah. For many situations in our work, there is a massive cost, both a real cost and an opportunity cost of taking the wrong path. Okay. And it's not very easy to just say, oh, this is the wrong path, so let's backtrack, right? There's all sorts of issues that we run into in backtracking from the wrong path, right? So I think like that it's important to understand like this idea being something that you should make part of your operating system of what not to do. Now, on the question itself, like what not to do, like actually a lot of what I write about is exactly this, right? Which is what paths to avoid. And to do full justice to this answer, it would easily take 2 days, right? Because there are so many things that one should consider not doing as a PM. But the main thing I'll perhaps share is that we need to be very cognizant as PMs of our own kind of cognitive biases, as well as the cognitive biases that we fall prey to as a team. Okay. And that I think is the root of many problems that we face, including lack of enough product success and bad execution and all sorts of other challenges that we have. And so just basically avoiding some of these kind of team cognitive biases ends up being really useful. So I'll share one example, and perhaps later I can share like a thread where I've talked about a lot of these cognitive biases. But one that I'll share is what I call the execution orientation fallacy. Okay. So this execution orientation fallacy takes the form of we tend to get attracted to things that we know we can execute easily. And as a team, we will take on those things at the expense of taking on more ambiguous work, which is actually going to have a larger impact, right? And this happens all the time on teams, right? All the time when you're doing sprint planning or quarterly planning, most teams, most mayor teams I've seen, even at these world-class organizations where I've advised or worked, most of the average teams that don't achieve really great results or outcomes and are constantly facing problems, they fall prey to execution orientation fallacy all the time, right? And their justification is this is low hanging fruit, or this is very well defined, or this customer asked for it, so we're going to build it, right? And it's very clear, and like it just gives us a way to launch. And again, all this popular wisdom around like launch, right? It gets in the way because you think you're doing the right thing, right? But if you kind of almost only do things that are very clear and you don't take on ambiguous problems, what's going to happen is you're basically going to build a very average product. Because guess what? Your competitor is doing the same thing, right? So how are you going to differentiate, right? And many people think, oh, we're going to differentiate with our execution speed. But you can't really do that unless you are like just a very nimble 2, 3, 4, 5, 10% organization. You can't always differentiate through your execution speed, right? So this execution orientation fallacy is an example of the kind of thing that once you understand, you will not follow certain paths. And I'm not saying don't ever work on things that are easy or don't ever work on things that are like very clear, but we've got to have a much more balanced view of the kinds of things we take on as priorities. So perhaps that's an example, but like I said, later I'll share like a link to a thread which lists various other cognitive biases and fallacies that we fall prey to.
Thank you for sharing, Shreyas. Particularly with examples is great, and any kind of threads that you want to share with the community, we can definitely add that after. The next question, and I know you're actually pretty passionate about this as someone who coaches and advises both startups and founders. The question is, how did you get started actually with advising and coaching as a career path when you don't have a strong company brand name association?
Yeah, so how does one get started if one doesn't have a big brand or a famous brand on their resume? It is going to be harder in some ways, right? And that is one dimension of how it is harder, right? So in my case, I had some nice brands on my resume. So that was not an issue for me. But the issue for me was that I've never held a big title, right? Like I've never been CEO, right? And frankly, I haven't even had the CPO title, right? Like I may have performed the role in some ways, but I've never had that title, right? So each of us faces some dimension of this, right? So it's easy to look at my resume and say, oh, you have all these awesome brands, and so it must be easy. Maybe, but not necessarily, not necessarily. And the common advice is, oh, you need to go get that. In fact, that's the advice I got when I asked a few people, hey, I'm thinking of doing this advising thing. What should I do? People rightly pointed out that, look, you haven't been CEO or you don't have the official CPO title on your resume. So maybe that's the next step you take. I don't believe in that. I actually bypassed all that. And I think most people should bypass those kind of like little steps. If you think you're going to be very good at it and if you're going to enjoy something, try to figure out a straight line path to get there. Okay. So that's the principle I want people to understand. Now to get to this question, right, of what do I do if I don't have a great brand name, right? Maybe you don't have a great brand name, but you have a great title, right? So you might leverage that. Second thing I'll suggest is you must do a lot of this pro bono early. I get a lot of people approaching me with similar kinds of questions. Oh, I want to start a course. I want to do this. I want to do advising. I want to do whatever. And oftentimes their first question to me is, how do you charge for this? What is the right rate? How do you monetize, right? Like, how do you do marketing? And these are all wrong questions. They're absolutely wrong questions. Because when you're starting out on something, the only thing I recommend fixating on is, how do I get great at it? And this is not some idealistic advice, because I want you to understand one thing. If you're going to do advising or coaching or something else, right, as an alternative path after your PM career or in parallel, what I want you to understand is that there is a huge power law at play in these alternative careers. Okay. And just like in VC, like The power law at play is, and this is a part everybody needs to pay attention to, right? An average product manager or an average PM leader, whether it's a director, VP, etc., still in our industry makes a lot of money. Okay, a decent amount of money, right? Like you can live a comfortable life wherever you are. An average startup advisor will monetize to zero. An average executive coach will monetize to exactly zero. Right? Because in these alternative careers, the power law is quite extreme, right? Where the top 10 and top 20% of the people are able to get a large percentage. I'm not calculated it, but it might be as high as 90% of the actual monetizable value. Okay. So now if you want to monetize this thing, your main challenge is not marketing or pricing or what should your website look like. Your main challenge is how do you get into this top 10, top 20% bucket, right? So the first couple of years, and don't think of this as an immediate transition, right? The first couple of years as you're thinking about making this transition, absolutely you must fixate on the only the one thing of how do you get great at it, right? And so then how do you get great at it, right? The way you get great at it is you get practice. Now the thing with practice is you're not going to get, there's a chicken and egg issue, right? You're not going to get the practice unless there are people who can try it out with you in an easy way, right? So if you quote, oh, here's my $2,000 an hour rate for advising, right? And you're still not great, and you don't have a track record, you're going to get exactly zero clients, right? So there is a lot of stigma associated with doing pro bono work. There are many people who feel proud and they'll tweet, oh, I will never do free work. I am worth a lot, etc., etc. That's fine. Then you should go do the PM job, right? Because that will pay you what you are worth, right? But if you want to do advising, if you want to do executive coaching, if you want to do leadership coaching, if you want to do various other things, you must get practice. You must then therefore do a lot of work pro bono. I also did that, right? I still do pro bono work, right? So that's my main advice is fine. You don't have a great brand on your resume, right? But you should open yourself up, right? Like you should talk to one other example. I talked about my PM career course, right? I would not have been able to create such a powerful course that impacted so many people if I had not just picked up the phone when somebody called me and said, Shreyas, I need career advice, right? Ended up as a result of doing all of that pro bono, I ended up talking to hundreds, close to 1,000 people, right? So I got a view that nobody else has, which is like, how do careers work and what kinds of mistakes people make and how do people grow in their career, et cetera, right? So you also have to be open to and like optimistic about how all of this will work out, right? If you are the kind who just does work this week and says, okay, how much did I earn from all this advising work at the end of this week? And if you earn zero, you get demoralized. You're not cut out for it, right? You have to play the long game here. So hope that helps. And I think what I wanted to share was not just for the advising question, but for any kind of these kind of alternate careers, even if it's like the career as a creator or a writer or creating your own Substack or whatever else, the same principles apply.
Thank you for sharing, Shreyas. We're coming up almost in time. We've got just under 10 minutes left. The next one that had a lot of community interest was actually focused on your structured and succinct communication skills. The person specifically referenced that. What practical advice or tips would you suggest to hone those skills?
Yeah, for me, communication has been a huge challenge throughout my career. And it took me many years, and I still work on it's one of the skills I work on the most, because I feel like I'm far from being done, far from mastery in it. And perhaps a couple of ideas I can share on the specific question of like, how do you communicate concisely and clearly? The first thing I'll observe is most people when they're trying to communicate something, they're looking for words, right? And sometimes people will come to me and say, hey, can you write this better? All right. And, oh, like can you suggest a different word for this? And what I learned, and it took me many years to learn this, what I'm about to share with you. What I learned is that when you're starting to think about communicating something, you should not be in the domain of words. Don't think about the words. Don't think about, oh, what is a better word, or how do I frame this sentence more clearly, or how do I shorten this? None of that matters, right? What I want you to spend time on is the domain of the idea itself, right? Which is mainly ask the question, what am I really trying to say? So again, this is important, right? So is this, what am I really trying to say? Just keep repeating that in a loop, right? And again, if you find yourself looking for words, right? Oh, I'm trying to use this. No, what I'm asking is, what is your main message? And you can apply it at the macro level when you're writing like a big document for an executive, or you can apply it at the micro level, which is, oh, this paragraph is not clear, right? The document is clear, but this paragraph doesn't like create that clarity. How do I create that clarity? Forget the words. What am I really trying to say? Okay. Make a practice of doing this. The first couple of times you do it, it'll be frustrating. Don't give up. Because only when you can get clarity on what you are really trying to say, right, can you then express it clearly to the audience. Most people, they're not clear in their own head what they're trying to say. So they're just like putting a bunch of words out there, and like now they're like just like they're swimming in that sea of words, and so is their audience, right? So start there. So that's one main thing I'll say about communicating concisely, because what happens once you do that is, once you have clarity, you will find that the words just take care of themselves, right? And on this one, you just have to trust me that once you get that clarity, you will find the words. And yeah, sure, you can then tweak the words, just like I did with this ChatGPT example I showed you, right? But don't jump into the words right away. This applies to verbal communication as well. Another tip I will share, and I've always, like on verbal communication particularly, is I've always struggled with concise, powerful verbal communication. I still struggle with it. And one of the tactics I found useful is early on in the day, I actually would go through all my meetings for the day, and I would just spend 10 minutes basically looking at each meeting and spending 30 seconds or 1 minute on each meeting and thinking about, what is my main goal out of this meeting, right? What is my main goal out of this meeting? And then furthermore, just asking, what is it that I want to make sure gets communicated to the other person or persons, right, at my end? And I would sometimes I would write it down, other times I wouldn't even write it down, right? It would just be in my head. But just going through that exercise made me much clearer when I walked into the meeting room or I opened the Zoom room, right? Because I knew what I wanted to make sure happened, what goal I wanted to achieve out of this meeting. And then I ended up being a lot more clear and a lot less verbose about it, because I just put in a little bit of extra effort earlier in the morning. So those would be a couple of tips I would share on this topic.
Very practical. Thank you for sharing. We have a minute left. Do you think we could squeeze in a question? If you could maybe
Let's do it.
Perfect. Wow, so many great questions. I'm gonna try. Okay, so I can let you choose actually, because I was gonna try to do it fair with the most upvotes, but the top two questions have split 19 votes each. One's more around how PMs in smaller companies should think about building products when trying to compete with bigger companies. And the other question is actually very different. It's actually on a career break. Is it okay to take a career break? How long is too long? Do you fancy either question?
Yeah, for the smaller company, big company question, I just posted a link to a thread. It's one of the threads where I talk about this topic of like how as a small company you can compete with the big gorilla in the space. And so take a look at that. Also, look up Counter Positioning, which is out of Hamilton Helmer's 7 Powers book. He talks about 7 strategic powers. Counter positioning is one of them. It is my favorite power of the 7. But oftentimes you are able to counter position as a sort of small company trying to compete with a very large incumbent. So anyway, take a look at those things. The other question was like about a break. Is that right?
Yes, it's about the topic of a career break. Is it okay to take a career break, and how long is too long?
Yes. Okay. I have worked with some people who have taken career breaks, including my own, my wife took a career break as well. She's also in tech. She and I went to the same grad school and got our CS degree, and she took a career break as well. And I've obviously worked with her and seen her experience as well. And I've worked with a few folks on my team and whatnot. So based on some of those observations, a couple of things I would share is ultimately like, you need to do what's right for you, and your life is about more than just your career, right? And so if you need to take a break, or if you want to take a break, take it, right? Don't hesitate. And sometimes firms like the one we are going to right now are actually a good opportunity to take a break and upskill, take a step back, etc. Right? So I'm all for doing that. What I usually recommend is that when you are taking a break, don't go entirely to the other extreme and don't go to 0%, which is, okay, I don't want to think about tech. I don't want to touch tech. I don't want to do anything related to product. Okay, by the way, if it's better for your mental health to do that, but unless it is like absolutely critical for your mental health, don't go absolutely to 0%, right? Instead, try to find some activity that keeps you in the game, whether it's like a part-time consulting thing, or whether it's pro bono advising, right? Or being more active in on Lenny's community, as an example, right? It doesn't matter. You have so many options. Or maybe it's going back to writing code, right? And building small apps or whatever else, right? And you don't even have to launch those apps. But whatever it is, keep a certain percentage still allocated to your work, your craft, your industry. Okay, so that's one key thing I recommend. And that's useful from 2 perspectives. One, it will build to something better for whenever you're going to go back into the game, right? But the second thing is it gives you a way to credibly fill that gap in that resume, right? Because whether we like it or not, there are some companies that will bias against people who've taken a long break where they've done nothing. And people encounter this all the time, where they take a break, maybe 2-year break, 3-year break even, and they're like, how do I explain this? And then some companies will ask you that as well. Now, I'm not in favor of companies like really probing on that, but I can't change the whole world, right? So I do have to understand that I'll have to explain this to some companies who care about this for whatever reason, right? Maybe I still want to join that company. I need to be able to credibly explain what I did. And I think like just staying in that game lets you credibly explain that. Plus, you can be open about the fact that, yeah, it was a time of transition for me. It was a time of break for me. But by showing that you did something meaningful, something substantial while you were on that break, you're also showing that you're naturally passionate about whatever it is that you are doing. And so you can turn that seeming negative thing, which is, oh, there's a break, into a positive. So those would be some like concrete things I would recommend as you're kind of thinking through this.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I only took a career break. I think a lot of that really resonates. And I also love the fact that you took on both questions. Thank you so very much, Shreyas, for being very generous with your time and coming on to chat with us and Lenny's community. For everyone who'd like a recording of this, please just make sure you've registered on Luma. I'm sure there's plenty of nuggets, golden nuggets that we can keep coming back to. So as long as you've registered on the Luma event, everyone will get the recording of this. So yeah, massive thank you, Shreyas, on behalf of everyone here.
Thank you. Thanks, Shrey, for having me. And thanks to everybody for joining. I really enjoyed the conversation, loved the questions, and looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Perfect. See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.